Well, it's great to be in my hometown. I forgot what springtime was like in Ottawa. What a delight. I've just was with Bill on March the 4th in Toronto, and I'll talk a little bit about why we were together. But since then, I've been in 7 cities and 4 countries, and I'm running on about 4 hours sleep. But I really, really wanted to be here this morning. And the reason I wanted to be here was precisely for the introduction and the sort of setup that Bill provided to us this morning. However, I'm the last person before coffee break, so I'm reminded of what Liz Taylor said to one of her many husbands: "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." So, so I'm here really on behalf of Tom Axworthy, who's the chair of the Blue Economy Initiative, but I'm also here with Carice Muir, who hopefully many of you have already met, who's the project coordinator and the person really responsible for making all of this happen. And when I look at the conference theme, the changing paradigm, we really are in a very changed environment. The reason why I've been traveling so much is I've been conferencing a lot, as much as anything else. I was at the World Water Technology Investment Summit in London, and then I've just come from the annual Clean Tech Forum that takes place in San Francisco every year, founded by our group, the Clean Tech Group, and that brings together nearly 1,000 of the kind of decision makers, Bill, that you're interested in, who actually put money to work and make policy and so on. And I'm happy to say that Canada, including Nova Scotia, had a very significant presence there. So while we sometimes feel that Canada may be not doing a lot, I would argue that Canadians, such as Bill Cosgrove, are doing a great deal. So I'm here really to talk about a story about water and how we can get the attention of the kind of decision makers that, again, Bill was just referencing. And when I was first invited to get involved in a discussion about water in Canada, we recognized that, sort of like global warming on a day like today, it's hard to get Canadians to take it seriously. And, you know, we have this perception, as Xavier mentioned, that, you know, we have an abundance of water. So it's a kind of what me worry type situation. And yet the paradox or the irony is that we live in a world where we all know in this room we're dealing with immense and looming water scarcity, which is likely to be worse than we think it's going to be because of climate change and consumption patterns. And so how do you get Canadians' attention? So the genesis of the Blue Economy Initiative was by saying, well, actually, if you situate Canada within a broader global context, we need to be good stewards of our water, if not excellent stewards, because the world needs us to be good stewards. We're going to need to make many of the things that the world needs. And if we're not good stewards, it'll be a one-time hit where we diminish our resources rapidly in order to provide the food and energy and minerals and metals that the world needs. But then what? So that changes the story because it turns a negative into a potential positive. And that's really what BEI is about. So BEI is a collaborative launched about 18 months ago by 3 organizations of excellence. Now, if you don't know who the Canadian Water Network is, then you really have been partying all week. So I'm not going to go there, but I've worked very, very closely with Bernadette, who you all know, around this. Most of you will know RBC's big commitment to water, $50 million over a long period of time, and the initiatives they've taken. And of course, the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, who've led the philanthropic effort amongst other institutions in water. So it's really an all-star team who've lined up to launch this initiative. And so really our vision, so far at least, is tied to this background narrative that I was just sharing with you, that Canada can and must be a water leader for our own sustainable prosperity. And what we want to do is bake water sustainability into every economic development decision that gets made in this country, whether it's about the design of cities or how we farm or how we attract foreign investment. So the mission really is to catalyze a well-informed discussion. And as you'll see from some of the research that we've already done, that's a challenge because we're missing a lot of data. So getting a well-informed discussion going is extremely important. And it's not just the discussion, it's about harnessing those assets and strengths that we have in a rapidly changing world. So ultimately, we're looking to build a business case, not just a case for business people, but a business case that is irrefutable and compelling and inclusive because it has to be all of those things. So I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second, and I'm just trying to make sure I stay synced in with my slides. Sorry, I realized I'm down there. So let me just see if I'm getting ahead of myself or not. Yeah, okay, so I'm on the right slides here. Yeah, there we go, I'm good. So it's the 3 C's, convene or generate content that fills in gaps and starts to generate a story of how we move forward, to convene people, and we've just had our first event, and I'll tell you more about that and things to come, and then really ultimately to catalyze action. So it's a sort of a cascading flow of things. We need to understand the value of water, and I actually don't dare disagree with Bill Cosgrove on many fronts, but I actually think we do value water. We just don't realize we value it. Anybody here drink beer? Right? We actually value water. People drive cars. There's a lot of water that goes into making that. We pay a lot of money for cars. So we actually pay a lot of money for water, and we buy bottled water. Hopefully nobody here does. But we do value it. We just don't realize we value it, and that there's a lack of transparency around that. So we have to understand the risks, not just the risks of being degrading water ecosystems and so on, but the risks of our future sustainable economic prosperity. And then, above all, our narrative is about how do we capitalize on the opportunities so that we feel compelled to protect this vital asset, not just for 35 million Canadians, but for 7 to 9 billion people coming on the planet. So, for starters, when we launched the BEI, we decided to update the original study that was done by Andrew Mueller a generation ago. Believe it or not, for the first time in probably about 25 years, there was an economic analysis of where do we stand in Canada vis-a-vis water. And we asked Steve Renzetti and Diane DuPont from Brock University to come together and update the original analysis around this, and that report is available off the BEI website. But the short version is, when we estimated the value of water to the Canadian economy, we got a very, very precise number, somewhere between 8 and 23 billion. And that's probably a gross underestimate. We couldn't even figure out the value of water to the oil sands. So that's a major problem because, as we all know, if you can't measure things, you can't really act on them and value them. So the reality is we don't know. We have a very poor economic understanding of water in the Canadian economy, and that's a rather shocking observation. Secondly, we're kind of missing the bus, as I would call it. We don't realize the scale of innovation that's happening elsewhere in the world. We talk about the Dutch, we talk about the Singaporeans and the Israelis, but most of us in Canada, and particularly in our research community, may not be aware that more than half the patents filed in water now are filed in Asia. In fact, last year alone in China, they filed over 5,000 water-related patents. And you compare that to the United States, the number was about 1,200. Now, patents are not all made equal, but that number is indicative, if not conclusive, that places that are under deep water stress are not going to wait for us to come up with the solutions. They're going to develop them themselves unless we get there as well and show that we're not only developing things, but we've adopted them, they work, and we're willing to share with the broader global community. So, on March the 4th, which is the last thing I did in Canada before I left for a couple of weeks, I was with Bill Cosgrove and a group of about 50 real top leaders cutting across many different sectors from academia, business, and so on in Toronto. And we had our first meeting based on a draft of this report, which we'll talk about a little bit more before I get off stage. And we had 3 panels, and it was very sort of Chatham House rules. Let's just get down and sort of have an honest conversation. And we talked about what are the opportunities given the global water context, and secondly, what are our strengths, honestly? What are the gaps? And then, above all, what do we do? I won't spend a lot of time reflecting on the event right now because we've taken some of the more pertinent and seminal aspects of the workshop and baked it into the final version of this report, which is available to you here at the event. There's hard copies outside, and also it's downloadable from the BEI website. But I think a couple of thoughts which I'd love to sort of share with you right now, and I've just gone way past what I want to do, would be, no, I'm here. No, where am I going? Where are we going? That's always the question, isn't it? Yeah, I finally caught up. Well, you really should get rid of all these PowerPoint things and just talk, right? So the biggest opportunities, as has been mentioned by Maggie Catley Carlson earlier this week and by other people, is not just about the pipes. As Xavier alluded to, it's about many, many other aspects of water. It's about new infrastructure, approaches to infrastructure. It's about urbanization. It's about agriculture, about systems design. And I think in Canada, it's as much about how we manage and harvest our resources sustainably. It was also about doable actions, about full cost accounting and pricing of water and price transparency. It was about developing a set of national principles, if not strategy, around water. And of course, some of these things are being worked on by the provinces working collaboratively together. And then about who can make it happen. And there's a lot of time spent looking at the role of the federal government. And I think the feeling was, yes, the federal government has to be an active participant, but not necessarily in terms of putting up huge sums of money in a fiscally constrained time, but much more in terms of creating the enabling environment around pricing and vision and building this into different facets of federal policy, such as the budget, which we expect later today. I don't think we have time to influence this year's budget, but we're working on next year's. So in terms of maybe one or two other takeaways, I don't want to go through all these things up here, but I do want to just dwell on my third bullet, which is the notion of exportable excellence. And we're only a few years away from our sesquicentennial in Canada, our 150th birthday in 2017. And, we're endowed with these riches, and which includes our natural resources and people from around the world. And it's really not good enough for us as Canadians just to sort of say, well, how do we protect ourselves in an increasingly turbulent and challenged world? It's about how can we take this lottery ticket that we have and put it at service of the world around us. And I think if we can marry that enlightened self-interest with what we're seeing, that really tunes into the way Canadians like to see themselves. And as many of us know, we've kind of lost our way, or perceived to have lost our way on the world stage in terms of making a difference and wanting to play that catalytic role in terms of human and planetary development. So I think that's the key to this, is that everybody at this workshop was excited by that perception of who we are and who we can be in the water space. So I've mentioned this report a couple of times. I know David Crane is here. We're very lucky to have one of Canada's best writers and most thoughtful thinkers on innovation to have supported us in putting this report together. I really commend it to you, and it builds off the Renzetti report rather elegantly. And essentially, what the report gets at is the following things. That we do have tremendous research capabilities. I know some of us feel those are being undermined somewhat right now, but that we still have those assets. We have, despite the perception of Canada as a water-abundant place, experience with our own water challenges. We have major, across the country in many different ways. We know a lot about water management, so-called software and soft side of this stuff. We have skilled workers. We still have, I believe, the best process engineers in the world in Canada in many, many different sectors, from forestry to mining and points in between. And then we also have great companies. Now, we're not necessarily very good at growing these companies. We take them to a certain size and then we sell them to foreigners. But that we can and must create the next RIMS of water technology and services and products related to that. So, unfortunately, at this stage, we have more questions than answers. How do we build a national water opportunity strategy, or the principles around one? We're, like with energy, we're not necessarily very comfortable at doing that kind of thing on a national level, but we need to have some kind of coherent vision around what we see as an economic development strategy built on sustainability principles. How can we really take all the ideas that are bubbling up from here and that we've just heard Xavier talk about? How do we commercialize this new technology? How do we bring it to scale? How do we accelerate adoption in a time frame that's meaningful to all concerned, all stakeholders? And how do we move towards full cost accounting? Do we do it on a sector by sector basis? Do we do it on consumer level? Do we price it into products? How do we get there? And then, if we get this right, we should be able to attract a huge amount of foreign investment into industries where we say, yep, come here, use our water, but the quid pro quo is you have to be part of the sustainability mantra around that. But that should enable us to attract the investment that we so dearly need in Canada, including in the manufacturing sector, as will be emphasized in today's federal budget. And then, who are the champions? Is this grassroots? Is it all about social media? Do we just go to Facebook? Or is it, do we need other champions? And in particular, how do we engage business leaders in this conversation? Because in the current culture, finance and business leaders tend to have a very loud voice. So, coming towards the sort of wrapping up a little bit on my on this talk, we're very excited by the progress we've made with the Blue Economy Initiative in the last year in particular. We know that the world faces no bigger challenge than water, because there's no substitute for it, other than powdered scotch, of course, which is my favorite line. And that we must and can be a major leader in this area. And as Canada looks to the next generation of knowledge-based industries, there's no one that's more obvious for us. So in the next 6 months, we're going to do the following things. We're going to have an event, probably in Alberta, maybe in Lethbridge or Calgary, in June, that dives into one particular area that we think is most appropriate given the global challenges and our strengths and assets, which is food and agriculture. We'd love to talk more with people here about participation in that. And then we're going to have an event probably in Ontario in September around infrastructure and new ideas around that. And at the panel after the break, I'll be talking with Bill Mantell and others about new concepts around infrastructure and how we can get there in a fiscally constrained time. So that's kind of where we're at with BEI. There's lots of stuff on our website. Like I mentioned, Carice Muir is here. Bernadette, of course, knows a great deal about it, is actively involved on the steering committee, and I'll be here for the balance of the morning and would be delighted to chat with all of you about it. Thanks very much. Nope. Oh, no.
I think you have to if there are some. Are there a couple of questions?
I'll pose a question. Oh, can I pose a question? Anybody know, since we're going to coffee break, how many liters of water it takes to make a cup of coffee? Indeed, 140 liters, roughly, to make a cup of coffee. So just be mindful of that at the break. Okay, Bill, I've stalled. Maybe we can take another question.
All right. Someone from the audience. In the back.
I've got a question here, Nick, if I may. Apparently I may not.
Who is it? Who's speaking?
Nick, we haven't been a water solutions country yet, and the hope is that we will be. You must have in your mind things that we lack at this point in time, and I'd like your sort of hard-nosed look at what it is that you think we lack. Is it initiative? Is it our Canadian gentle nature? Is it resources? Do we lack talent? Do we lack perspective? Do we lack leadership? What's standing in the way? What would be the first 2 or 3 things that you think would get in the way of us becoming a water solutions country?
Well, we do tend to be hard on ourselves here, and I think, you know, Andrew Benedict, who founded Xenon and is living a lot in the States, at our March 4th workshop said, you know, folks, having lived in the States now, actually our government's not so bad up here, okay? So we could be pretty hard on ourselves. And, you know, in a country with not enough people and too much geography, we do a really good job with things like the Canadian Water Network. We're really good at innovating and starting and coming up with ideas, and we're really good as individuals, Exhibit A, on the world stage, at bringing people together. I also believe, but the challenge is converting that innovation into scalable entrepreneurial activity. And we need that entrepreneurial activity because we need to create the jobs and the wealth that enables us to do all the other things we want to do, whether it's early childhood education and so on. So why are we not good at scaling entrepreneurial solutions? Well, I don't believe it's because we lack good entrepreneurs. Canadians are really good at things like that. What we have is a very conservative financial system. We have a paucity of risk capital for scaling entrepreneurial activity. And then when we get companies to a certain level, we tend not to support them and make them into global champions. So that's a challenge that, you know, is not unique to water, and it's not a problem that's only you know, with any particular government regime. But it is something that is a problem that we need to address and be more confident about. The second challenge, I would say, around that is we've been a bit slow to engage the world. We've got the world's largest market just south of us. I was sharing with Americans this week, you know, we really understand you guys. We know what it's like to have difficult people south of your border. No, anyway. Anyway, they didn't like that one. But anyway, I couldn't resist. So, you know, we've got the luxury of this huge market, and yet that's not where, you know, that's not where we're needed. And so we need to raise our sights. And it's kind of ironic. We're the most multicultural global country in the world, and yet we're so parochial. We're so slow to get off the plane in India and China and other places. So we need to up our game there. So I think it's those two things. We need to be less risk-averse in the financial sector and in backing and supporting and scaling entrepreneurship. And we need to harness this unique asset that we have, which is the world is here, to go out into the world.
Thank you. Here's another question.
So I actually have a comment now and a question. And the comment is that I totally agree with you in the sense that Canadians or Canada has great ideas, but we don't take those ideas and then turn them into tangible products and innovation. I was at Americana this week, and I was so impressed by the French and the Belgium. There's this small company, a guy that was probably 30 years old, and he had built an online monitoring system for micro constituents in water, pHs, phenols, at the ppb level. I'm like, well, how did you think about this? He's like, oh, I'm just an environmental engineer, and I have a business background, but I work with someone from University of Sherbrooke. I work with someone from Po in France, right? And so they're leveraging the ideas from academia, like a room like this, and they're turning them into commercial products. That guy had three people around me. He had 2 installations in 6 months at a refinery and a municipality in Germany, right? So anyway, just a comment to say is that maybe this is the forum where we need to bring more private sector too, so they could learn, and they could, you know, pull these ideas and start to build and innovate.
It's very interesting to see what's happening elsewhere in the world. Corporations, you know, you don't have to love corporations to recognize their role in the market economy. And most major corporations are embracing this concept of open innovation. They used to think that if it wasn't invented in their own labs, it wasn't going to work. And you know, if you just look at what the presentation we had on Europe, that's a good example of that. But open innovation is very much part of this. And major corporations around the world are embracing this. So, for example, a company like Intel are one of the largest investors in water technologies. Why? Because you build fabs where the air is dry, and you need a social license to operate, and so you need on-site water purification and recycling, and so on and so forth. We don't necessarily see that with our large corporations here. Far too many of them are branch plant companies, so the decision-making is not here. But a company like Unilever is investing hugely in water-related technologies. But is Unilever Canada doing that? So I'm not criticizing Unilever, I'm just pointing out that we have that challenge. But really it's in our resource companies that I think we really need to do. There's a lot of good technology sitting inside, for example, the mining companies, but it doesn't get commercialized for reasons that are understandable. That's not their mandate, and even if they did get commercialized, it's a rounding error in their bigger profit and loss statements. But I think it's not about so much corporate social responsibility, which is the conversation we tend to have in Canada. It's about a more intentional, more strategic approach to creating value and using their platforms and their resources. So I would love to see more corporations here, not just looking for ideas, but looking for collaboration at scale. And I think, you know, for example, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, which I hope gets some funding in today's budget, is a really good example of how we do things well in Canada. And we do other things well, but that's a good example, and maybe that's the way forward as we go forward.
Question?
I have a question. If you...
Should I go? Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. We're too polite as Canadians. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, a question and little story to answer some of your questions. First, my name is Constance Herrera. Just to present a bit, 2 years ago I came here as a PhD student in public administration. Someone who, in my university, they thought I was a bit crazy of thinking of studying environmental policy and water policy, when everyone in public administration thinks about all sorts of other problems to study. Anyhow, now I'm here 2 years later as a starting or budding entrepreneur. So it's a real story of changing paradigms, because I met a lot of barriers as a student in a non-science area, although I studied physics before at bachelor's, but anyhow, barriers at funding for research. And now I decided to come in through trying to start a company just to tell you what we do, or what we're hoping to be able to do, which answers a bit your preoccupation, is how to make people value water, is actually to make them aware of what they're using. And in particular, in places where we wouldn't even think that water is being used a lot. For example, just one example is air conditioning, all the cooling and heat transfer systems in big buildings. Now there's opportunities coming up in places like Montreal, for example, where there's a Quebec province-wide strategy to reduce potable water use. So they're going to be wanting people to change their air conditioning systems, and in places like hospitals and others, they don't even realize that how much water is going through those systems and leaked. Anyhow, our small company is trying to establish a system that will make users aware in the building through the rest of their facilities management systems to see how much water they're consuming and combined with their energy expenses and that's how I think, or we believe, that you could get people to actually reduce consumption or be smarter about their consumption with reuse and other systems that do exist. All the technologies, when they would be plugged in, you would be able to reduce peak demands of energy and your peak costs, and etc. I won't come into all the detail, but in answer to your question of how do we help entrepreneurs commercialize new tech, well, one thing is to maybe make things a little bit easier at the start point. After many years of graduate studies, it's kind of hard to have capital to start with. When you get to the bank, you're more in debt than having that seed money that everyone asks for, like at the Research Council. There's great programs like the Programme d'aide à la recherche industrielle or others, but that's maybe if the people who are aware of how to help, maybe that's where I would suggest that you start, is that how to get the initial push, and especially if you don't have any professors who are backing you up because they're thinking about other policy issues and you're not a recognized multi-paper published researcher, more of a consultant. So it's things like that. It's lowering barriers, especially for people coming from side sectors, and yeah, probably suggesting how to get seed money.
Three quick comments on that. One is we've done some good work, particularly where I live in Toronto with the Mars Innovation Hub there and other initiatives at creating some of these platforms now. Well, now we need to do this across the country with seed funding and so on, which is very, very difficult to get anywhere in the world right now. Secondly, I wanted to mention, I don't know if anybody here, people here are familiar with a company called Nest, N-E-S-T. You will be. This is a company started by the people who created iTunes at Apple and other products, and they're going to create something as elegant as all the Apple products that half the people here, most people under 40, enjoy. And it's the world's most simple, elegant, usable thermostat. And so on top of your innovation, you need to have that kind of user, consumer-friendly thing that is beautiful and elegant, because it's not about the technology. None of us buy technology. We buy products and services and things that we enjoy. So that I encourage, and that's part of the design and innovation strengths that we have in Canada, at the Alberta College of Art and Design, and in Ontario and in Quebec and so on and so forth. So that's important too, because water's a pretty, it's industrial engineering stuff, and if we want to create consumer adoption, we need to borrow from the Apples of the world.